Hey everyone, and welcome to D&D Horror Stories with D&D Doge. In today's video, we have a story about a dungeon master that slowly makes the D&D campaign worse and worse due to constantly being drunk. And forewarning, it does contain a mention of SA. Then we have a story about a player that just doesn't seem to want to join the party, and more. So, without further ado, let's get into these stories. Sexist, power-hungry dungeon master ruins the campaign with one wooden arrow. By Reddit user, Such a Coffee Cat. This one is a bit long, so bear with me. The year was 2015. I was fresh out of a toxic relationship that isolated me from almost all of my friends, miserably working at the coffee shop on my college campus. One of the few friends I'd managed to stay in contact with, we'll call her Salida, her character name, was in the lobby, prepping for her Dungeons & Dragons session later. And when she told me that's what she was doing, I lit up. I'd grown up hearing tales of D&D from my dad and uncle, a couple of nerds who played non-stop growing up. But they'd never played with me because they, quote, couldn't remember the rules. So the prospect of actually knowing someone who played was very exciting to me. Salida promised to ask the group how they'd feel about adding another person, and went on her way. A quick side note, this friend was the ex of the Dungeon Master. At the time, he hadn't really shown any differentiation. Dungeons & Dragons was kept separate from personal drama, which is why she didn't leave the group. Now, I'm sure that there are people out there that can pull this off, though there has to be a bit of awkwardness in staying in a game ran by your ex. But let's see how this works out. I found out later that apparently he thought Salida was bringing me to set me up with him as a prank? Quite ironic considering how things turned out, and couldn't be farther from the truth. But I digress. How would that be a prank? And a prank on who? I feel like OP just kinda glossed over that tidbit. The group was open to me joining, and I sat in on a session before making my character to make sure that she would fit in. She was your typical angsty OC, hell-bent on revenge against the demon that killed her mom and her aunt in front of her when she was 5, ran away at 14 to hunt her down, slept on the streets, yada yada yada. It was my first ever game, and these players were roleplay heavy, so I wanted to lean into it as much as I could. I gave the Dungeon Master several pages of backstory, at his request. I wasn't sure how much he wanted at first, and he seemed excited to tie it into the plot. The group was as follows, using character names instead of real ones, of course. Salida, the one who introduced me. Eva, rules lawyer and resident note-taker. Aline, cleric and mom of the group IRL, and in character. The first couple months were genuinely really fun, and quickly became the only good thing I had going on in my life. I became quite attached to my character and the party, in real life and in character. It's sad to say that wouldn't last very long. It started going downhill when a new player showed up. The Dungeon Master had run into him in the student lounge that we played in every week, and apparently invited him to join before we even got there. Well, that isn't good. Even if you're a DM and running the game, it's always common courtesy to discuss adding a new player with the group first. When we showed up, he asked us all in front of him, "Is it cool if he joins?" I was still relatively new, so I didn't feel like I could speak up, and the other players, I learned later, felt really uncomfortable with the way he asked, and put them on the spot. So even though we already had a good rhythm and didn't want to add anyone else to the table, nobody said anything to the contrary. We didn't become close out of game until much later, so pretty much everyone was looking to the others to decide, which meant that the Dungeon Master just added him. His character was named Kron, and any balance we'd had prior was immediately thrown out of whack. The group was all girls with a guy Dungeon Master before this, so we theorized later that maybe he felt outnumbered. But even so, he should have asked privately and then had him sit in the next week, like the way I had. It was disrespectful the way he just tossed Kron into the mix, and that's where the resentment started. If it would have just been that though, it would have dissolved over time. Instead, the Dungeon Master got less and less organized each session, a lot of the time just showing up and hoping that he'd written down notes for the next time on his last session's notes. He also started bringing those mini bottles of alcohol to the table. At first, he tried to sneak it so we wouldn't notice, but eventually, he'd just set them out on the table with his books. A lot of us couldn't legally drink yet, so it's not like we were all having beer together. This was in a public student lounge where he was the only one drinking, and heavily so. Even though he had an hour to drive home after sessions, he usually finished the sessions at least tipsy. Well, that's never good. Someone should have said something and took his keys, or at least made him get an Uber after the game. Never drink and drive, people. Again, we were all growing uncomfortable, but none of us were sure if it was bothering everyone else, so none of us said anything. It wasn't until he started blatantly disregarding Salada, his ex, in-game, that we started really talking. She could be mid-sentence, role-playing her in-character slow-burn romance with Eva, and he'd cut her off and switch scenes to Kron, hanging out with the dragon DNPC that he had created to be best friends with Kron. And there it is. Of course there's a DNPC. It got to the point that I texted Salada during the game like, what the heck, and she expressed her frustration to me. Shortly after, he started targeting me in the same way, cutting into what were supposed to be emotional scenes that he'd never taken from Kron or Eileen or Eva, just to quote, speed the story along. Eventually, Salada and I would text through the sessions anytime anything happened that irritated us. I know it was a bit immature, but I was frustrated and wanted to be sure if it was normal behavior or not, so it felt good to be validated and vent with someone who saw it happen. The alcoholism, the unpreparedness, the disrespect and disregard for us, the sexist NPCs, oh my god, there were so many, and many other things finally put us over the top, and Salada reached out to the other members of the group, except Kron. They'd shared our frustrations, and we agreed to have a serious sit-down conversation with the Dungeon Master about it. This was the one thing in my life that wasn't miserable, so the prospect of leaving made me sick, but it was getting to the point where I was irritated every session instead of having fun. And this is what all groups should do if there are things going on in a game that are bothering them. Sit down and talk it out. Not saying anything just assures that nothing will change, and will just let any resentment that is there grow. So before the next session, after we'd gotten our thoughts together in a constructive and diplomatic way, we sat him down and raised our concerns. He seemed surprised, like he'd never even considered that those things could bother us, even though he'd been steadily dungeon mastering since he was 12, and he was like 27 by this point. And he apologized. It seemed genuine, so we all relaxed a bit. He even promised to invest into a Dungeon Master screen and a notebook, to take time to get more organized, and maybe show up a bit early to prep more, etc. That session went by pretty smoothly, and this time he didn't touch the alcohol in his bag. Well, it seemed like the communication worked out, and the story ends here, right? Well, seeing how you're watching D&D horror stories, it has to go downhill. So let's keep going. Sadly, this didn't last. By the next session, everything was back to the way it had been, except worse in some ways. His NPCs were more aggressive, and his insufferable DM NPC, Desert, who he'd created for the sole purpose of sleeping with Salada as payment for plot information, began hanging around more and more, until he may as well have been part of the party, much to all of our chagrin. Instead of downing 3 or 4 mini bottles of Fireball or whiskey or whatever, the number continued to grow, and he'd frequently start before we even got there. He was still improvising entire sessions, and even asked me for more details on my dead mother's life and such, of which I typed up a whole page and gave it to him, only for him to blatantly disregard it and do the opposite of what I'd written, and then get mad when my character refused to go down the quest that he was trying to craft from it because the information was so obviously wrong that it was clearly a trap. He insisted that it wasn't incorrect because he was the dungeon master and that it was a twist, so I referred to the paper that I typed up for him. He seemed annoyed and let me drop the quest. I ended up moving in with him during this time too, desperate times and all that. I had to leave the apartment I was in because I stupidly hadn't insisted on being on the lease, so when they decided they wanted me gone, I just had to leave. Well, that sucks, and I don't see any good coming from this at all. The dungeon master had a recently empty room, and even though I didn't particularly want to live with him, I was desperate. I insisted on being on the lease this time at least. My first night there though, he got very drunk, and in turn got me very drunk, and took me up to his room under the pretense of playing Fallout 4 with him. Without going too into detail, especially as this isn't related so much to Dungeons & Dragons as much as it is about his character and the environment the game had turned into. That night ended in SA, and me hiding in the bathroom under the pretense that I forgot where I was, and slipping into my room and locking the door. This was the first night there, and we still played D&D together weekly. Holy crap. I was expecting, like, some clashing of heads, or something like that. Not that. What a frickin' scumbag. By this point, Saleda and I were texting during and after sessions, sometimes about the Dungeon Master, and sometimes about life stuff. Yiva was roped into this, and before too long, so was Aline. I'd even become casual in real life friends with Kron. I've got some stories about him too though, unfortunately, and how he learned how frustrated we were with the Dungeon Master. He even tried DMing for us one time, despite only having played D&D for a couple of months, and taking all of his dungeon mastering advice from our DM. That was a nightmare we can get into another time. Now, some might be wondering why OP still stayed and kept playing in the game after that. Well, that type of experience can affect people in different ways, and a lot of times, people don't report it and just try to keep going about life like it didn't happen, which seems to be the case here. We had one more sit down with the Dungeon Master before the end. There was this big battle he had been ramping up, where the demon from my childhood and another big bad that had been working with her were both gathering an army against us. The previous session had ended with my aunt apparently not being dead, but being in a magical coma for the last 16 years, and she'd woken up as soon as I'd hugged her. Anyway, we transported her back to the fort. We were like level 18 or so, and as the session ended, one of our sentries ran up to tell us that they were storming the fort and that we were all going to die. We thought it'd be a good time to talk with him before this big battle took place, because the way things were going, and with how frequently he bragged about having Dungeon Master power and the ability to kill our characters if he wanted to, we didn't want that energy in a big battle. And besides, the last time we talked to him, it at least got better for that session. At least that way, we could end, if we decided to leave, on a good note. This time though, he didn't receive our criticism quite so well. He was defensive and refused to admit that what we were saying was true. He was even upset that we brought up the alcohol again because, quote, it's stressful to DM, so he needed it to play nowadays. And that is a sign of a full-fledged alcoholic. The moment someone says they need to drink in order to do something, that is them self-prescribing alcohol for whatever reason. Note, it is absolutely stressful to DM. By this point in my life, I've done it a couple of times. But if you're at the point where you need to be shit-faced to run a game, you need to take a break. We could have rotated roles. Yiva had been vocal about wanting to run a game for a while. In other words, there was no excuse. He should have taken a step back ages ago. That talk got us pretty much nowhere, but he did claim that he'd get that notebook that he said he would. Yeah, he never did that, or the screen, or anything. And at that point, we were already gathered and ready to play, so we went along with the session. The battle started. There were thousands, and I do mean thousands, of monsters swarming the fort. Just about every NPC who ran our fort was killed, and our walls were destroyed. Then finally, I saw Ruby, the demon who killed my mother. Everything had come down to this, and even if this was the end of this game, considering how the talk had gone, at least I could have an epic battle with her. I went into this with the mindset of Alex, my character, might die today. She's charging head first because this is the closest she's ever been to her revenge. If she dies, I'm ready. This is going to be a hard fight. Ruby is very powerful. I mean, I was ready to burn all of my high-level sorcerer spells, and then charge in with a dagger. And then, Eva takes a shot with her bow. I mean, seriously, one shot, regular bow. She hit Ruby to help take down her HP a bit because she'd become one of the main BBEGs of this campaign. This should have been the equivalent of a paper cut. I mean, really, we were like level 18. A single arrow is nothing. But instead, before it was even my first turn in combat, by one effing arrow, Ruby falls, dead. Y'all, one wooden arrow killed our BBEG. Wow, talk about anticlimactic. Perhaps the DM was just too drunk to do the math and just said screw it. Immediately, the thousands of very real monsters that had been slaughtering our crew, not silent image, these were real, just disappeared as Ruby died. Alex took off running towards her body, sure that this was a trick. I reached down to check her pulse, and she was dead. But as I touched her skin, her voice started whispering in my ear, like she was always going to be in my head. Everyone, even Kron, just sat there, speechless. The dungeon master looked smug, and took another swig of the alcohol that he'd brought. I stood up and gathered my things and left, and I'd later learn that everyone else did the same. That's the last time any of us played with, or even really talked to DM. Instead, Eva started her own long-form campaign, and everyone but Kron joined. That game, not that campaign, we rotate those now, has been going on for about 6 years now, and it's still amazing, even though we're all on Discord video chat now. So yeah, I could have handled some of that better, and I should have left way sooner. But at least I ended up with a great group after the fact. But the moral of the story, if something seems wrong or bothers you, even if you're the new kid, speak up. Odds are it's not just you, and if it is, that's still reason enough to have a conversation. And if your entire group sits your dungeon master down and brings up a barrage of issues, and he doesn't change a thing, get out, fast. Well, that certainly was a freaking horror story. And OP makes some good points in bringing up issues with the group about things that may be bothering you, even if you are new. And if things don't seem to change, well, no D&D is better than bad D&D, and all that. But I can't ignore the whole SA thing, as OP seemed to just gloss over it. And perhaps that's another example of trying not to face it. Though, when asked in the comments of the post, she did elaborate that she did eventually tell everyone, but way after the whole situation was over, and that, even though it sounds silly, she felt like she had to protect the game from ending, and that telling anyone would make it end, which in all rights, it would have. She also said, quote, "It's pretty traumatic to have your abuser dungeon master the one thing, keeping you semi-sane, but at that time, it felt more dire to keep the peace," end quote. But I have to say, if anything like that ever happens to you, tell someone right away, whether it be a friend, family member, or even the police. And don't wait to do so either, as unfortunately, the longer someone waits to report something like that, the harder it is to prove that it happened. At least it seems like OP put this whole thing in the rearview mirror, and has been enjoying playing the game with the other players to this day. I think we all need a kitty after that story. There we go. That's a little better. And it looks like we have time for a few more stories, but this time, a bit on the lighter side of things. So let's get into them. D&D, Evil Party vs. Hat of Disguise by Reddit user Collect7. We were playing D&D in college, and to be edgy, we were playing evil characters, evil clerics, evil monks, an assassin, an evil paladin. You get the idea. We are having a good time being campy and quote evil, and a few other players asked to join. One of the new players, Ernst, wants to play a rogue. No problem. We are a little ways into the game, and so they get a few minor or moderately powerful items. Ernst wants a hat of disguise. No problem. So he gets it. Now, when we first started, we all made our players together, Session 0, as we call it now. But Ernst made his alone, and was introduced in play. His first scene was him disguised and hiding in a tree. He shoots us with a crossbow or something. We chase him, but he escapes. The players know that this is Ernst, but the characters are confused and dismayed. Was it the noble that we robbed? Or someone from the temple we despoiled? This happened twice more, and each time he would stealth, be disguised, ranged attack, run, change disguises, and escape. I don't know why he was doing this. Likely it was a mix of power tripping, and the classic, "this is what my character would do." Ernst was like this, and always was. The third time, we caught him, but he was disguised, and we could not be sure it was him. He spent a while telling us why we could not know it was him, that it could be anyone, etc. Though we pointed out this was an evil party, and we killed him, and that if we were wrong, oh well. Later, he rejoined as a mage who killed the party, quote, accidentally, with a fireball. After the DM allowed some resurrections, we did not allow him to rejoin. Yep, Ernst seemed like one of those players that just needs to be difficult to recruit, like Yuffie in the original Final Fantasy VII, and was dealing with a party of evil characters. Now, I can see a player doing what Ernst did maybe 1 or 2 times, but to keep on doing it and changing disguises is a bit much. Now, should the players have killed his character? I would say no. If anything, they should have had a talk with him above table about how that whole deal was starting to get annoying, and to just join the party already. At least they let him make a new character, but we all heard how that went, and I don't blame them for kicking him as a player after that, as it just seemed he wasn't a good fit for a cooperative storytelling game. So, what are your thoughts? Let's move on to today's final story. Dungeon Master forces players to be disabled by Reddit user ExpensiveAd1157. There hasn't been a single game where my character hasn't had an arm or leg chopped off in the first few sessions, forcing me to roll with disadvantage for the rest of the game. It usually doesn't require a serious reason, like a critical failure, to be disabled. My character lost an eye just by taking 2 damage from a weak enemy. He also likes to cut women's hair in combat and break armor. This happens regularly, several times per game, with multiple players. In a first encounter, he made sure that our tank could not carry a shield and use all of his abilities that required a shield in his hands. Players often died out of combat without rolling dice, if they simply didn't understand what to do in a new location, or did something wrong, like checking rocks before checking bushes, and an archer appearing in the bushes and instantly killing one of the players. If a character has companions or pets, he will also try to kill them. Is this normal for Dungeons & Dragons? Or am I taking this too seriously? How often do your characters lose limbs, eyes, or ears in your D&D sessions? Well, OP, I can tell you for a fact that this is not normal for D&D. It sounds to me like you have a murder hobo DM that has a DM versus player mentality. Just the thing about a player getting killed without any rolls due to an archer in a random bush tells me that much. And as far as getting limbs and such chopped off, let me put it this way. I've been in a campaign for about 5 years now, and not once has any of the player characters received any lingering injuries, as our dungeon master knows that would take a lot of the fun out of the game. My advice would be to try to talk to your DM and express that the way he is running the game is making it not fun for you or the other players, and ask if he can just run a normal campaign without lingering injuries. Then, if he isn't receptive to your plea, I would look for a new DM. Though that is just my thinking. What would you all suggest OP do? But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and hope that your games remain horror story free. Until next time.